The Sega CD was supported in North America from late 1992 to late 1995, with the vast majority of the system's popular titles being localized and released there. You can play great stuff like Snatcher, Sonic CD, Final Fight, and Soulstar, all titles that make owning the platform quite an experience. Of course, the Sega CD was available in other parts of the world under the banner Mega CD, keeping close ties with the Mega Drive branding from those regions as well. While their libraries mirrored much of what we saw in North America, they do have a small handful of very playable titles you may have missed. In this episode, we will be going over 7 games that were released on the Mega CD that were never released in North America, and discuss whether they are worth any of your precious time and effort. I hope you guys enjoy Mega CD games you may have missed. In March of 1993, iSystem Tokyo developed the Ninja Warriors, a port of the original Taito-developed arcade game. This is a horizontally scrolling hack-and-slash beat-em-up that has 2 mechanical ninja on a mission to assassinate an evil leader. The arcade featured a 3-screen setup, so the Mega CD version needed to be adjusted down to a single screen, kinda like the Darius games. I remember game magazines eviscerating this at the time of its release. It actually turned me away from importing it for years. The thing is, in regards to arcade ports, this actually isn't a bad game in the slightest. It follows the arcade version rather closely, keeps much of the visual detail, and sounds just as good. You even get a bit more story as to what the heck is going on in the game with this version. So then, if it plays like the arcade, looks similar to the arcade, and sounds like it should, why was it so hated? I mean, in comparison to other home ports of the arcade like the PC Engine version, it was quite a bit better. Much of what was hated in this game actually stems from the arcade itself. Your melee attack range is extremely limited, it's easy to run out of throwing knives, and the general gameplay is stiff and rather one-note. Many people also make the mistake of lumping in the Super Nintendo game of the same name as ammunition against this version, but that was not an arcade port of the original, and was instead a new take on the story with many enhancements developed 7 years after the fact. On the positive, the Mega CD game can easily be adjusted to, and you can still find some fun in this one. There's a block mechanic by holding the attack button, you can set jump to a button press instead of pressing up, and it fully supports 2-player co-op. In the end, this wasn't nearly as bad as I had envisioned, and it actually is one of the better true ports of the arcade original. It was only released in Japan. Also in March of 1993, Wolf Team released the infuriating Anet Futatabi, a side-scrolling beat-em-up that was part of the series of games that included El Viento and Ernest Evans. Unfortunately, this is a shallow Golden Axe clone that offers nothing but extreme irritation to all but the most patient. Anet only has a few moves in her arsenal, basic things like a sword attack, a grab and a throw, and a few running moves, most of which are utterly useless against harder enemies. She also has some magic attacks that charge automatically, but these are visually bland and do far too little damage to rely on regularly. But it really falls down on basic design elements like enemies hiding off the screen and not coming out, and some guys just hovering over top of you and hitting you the second you get up for vicious damage. And what happens when you die? Yep, your ass is at the beginning of the stage again. It has beautiful cinemas, but this game needed some major rebalancing before it could be called a decent game. If you are looking for a beat-em-up fix for your Sega CD, fire up Final Fight or Streets of Rage, and skip the anger management therapy you'll need after this mess. This again never made its way west. iSystem Tokyo was back again with a port of Night Striker for the Mega CD in May of 1993. This had been originally done on Taito's Z system, a powerful sprite scaling arcade platform that did other games like Space Gun and Chase HQ. That meant, of course, the Sega CD version here was never going to be perfect, but it had some sprite scaling hardware of its own, so surely it's going to still be cool, right? Well, not really. While it retains the overall design of the arcade, it takes a major hit in visuals. Everything is pixelated to hell, and it runs nowhere near as smoothly as the arcade. I always found this a puzzle because this game should have looked a lot better. There are examples of sprite scaling games on the Sega CD that absolutely destroy this visually, so there simply is no excuse for the way it looks. It does play okay despite the performance hit, and there is an arranged soundtrack to play to, but man is it a big disappointment overall. Fortunately, the Saturn release a few years later was vastly superior. Wolf Team was back again in May of 1993 with Devastator, a mixed-genre action game with both side-scrolling platforming as well as side-scrolling shoot-'em-up segments. I really dig this game for a number of reasons. First, it's got giant robots and monsters. Second, it looks good and has great color and animation. Lastly, it is easy to pick up and play and doesn't crush you under some ridiculous difficulty like a Net Futatabi. What we have here is a good old-fashioned simple but fun game that gets enough right that you appreciate it in your collection. Gameplay starts out with you in a mech form taking care of scrub enemies and basic left-to-right scrolling. Things get interesting pretty quickly though, and soon levels become multi-tiered labyrinths that require you to use a little more skill and timing. Then you get some great shoot-'em-up action to change things up. Each level ends in a boss encounter, and the cinemas aren't bad either. The power-up system allows you to easily choose your favorite weapon types, and later stages present enough challenge so you don't beat it the very first time you play it. In July of 1993, the Mega CD received the Telenet-developed Cyborg 009, a run-and-gun action game that puts you in mind of Alicia Dragoon the first time you play it. It has both auto-scrolling and self-paced stages, and of course the expected boss fights. It's based on a Japanese animated story of the same name, and has some nice colorful cutscenes to go along with it. This one is pretty bland, however, and fails to do any one thing strong enough to make it a solid recommendation. The visuals are colorful, but lack anything to make them stand out. Strangely, while there is never really a lot happening on screen, there is more slowdown here than you'd expect. The gameplay is similarly dull, with just your basic left-to-right platforming and shooting, but I did like the formulaic boss fights. The biggest problem with this game is that it just wallows in its mediocrity, and never tries much outside the experience it sets up right in the beginning. That means you get bored pretty quickly, and a few deaths will likely send you running for the power switch to put a new game in. This version was only for the Mega CD in Japan, though you can find Super Nintendo and PlayStation 2 games based on the same story. Remember the excellent Sengoku for the Neo Geo? In December of 1993, SNK and Sammy teamed up to bring that game to the Mega CD in Japan. This is a direct port of the arcade game, and surprisingly, it actually isn't anywhere near as bad as you'd think. The original was a pretty simple hack and slash beat 'em up, So you get the same here, including the ability to power up your character with additional weapons, and even the ability to transform to new, more powerful avatars with unique skills. Since the Mega Drive's color capabilities are nowhere near the level of the Neo Geo, that's what you'll first notice about the graphics. The visuals are definitely less detailed here, though you do get lots of large characters and backdrops that retain a fair bit of the original's pizzazz. The biggest cut is the complete lack of a two-player mode, one of the arcade's best attributes. You also get some pretty jarring transitions as the loading between areas just pops out of nowhere, something that can happen a few times per stage. I still enjoyed this port, however, and feel that it's definitely worth checking out if you've never played it. It's more of a curiosity these days with so many ways to play the original, but in 1993 it was great to see a Neo Geo port that wasn't terrible start to finish. In late 1994, Domark released Bloodshot in Europe, a first-person shooter that was also released as a cartridge on the Mega Drive there. The premise of this game is really simple. Fight your way to the plasma core of each level, destroy it, and then make your escape before the time runs out. Of course, the developers had to make it so it was challenging, so each level is set up as a maze of rooms and corridors that must be explored for both items and new weapons. It isn't a bad experience, with the biggest obstacle being its jerky and uneven performance. At times it can be smooth enough to aim reliably, but it can also be a slideshow, particularly around corners or with lots of enemies on the screen. The visuals are also very repetitive, making your getaway of larger stages tough if you don't pay close attention and memorize the map. The Mega CD version has a different soundtrack and some stage design differences, and they both contain two-player co-op and versus modes. A US version of the cartridge release made its way to the Sega channel around the same time, but no official Sega CD release ever happened. It's not anything special, doesn't use any of the scaling in the system to speak of, and gets pretty repetitive rather quickly. But considering the lack of options in the genre for the platform, it's still worth playing for the experience. You had to be pretty selective about importing Mega CD games back during its life. They ran $10 to $20 higher than Mega Drive games, which meant after import fees, you were often looking at $80 games or more when they first launched. Making a bad decision meant not just losing your money, but the time it took to save up that cash as well. Luckily today we have many more ways to try these games out and see what they offer us, and there are definitely a few here I think you should try. Some are simply worth playing to see something different, while a few are genuinely strong enough to consider finishing and worth owning. Most of these games suffer what befell most software for the platform. They simply didn't use the added features in any meaningful way. Aside from some nice CD-based music, the vast majority of what you see here could have been done on the vanilla Mega Drive without the $300 add-on. That was perhaps what was so distressing about owning a Sega CD. You bought it for its potential, but rarely would you see it realized. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.